Heard you loud and clear. If you don't stay quiet and eat in peace, I'll call security when we land." Those were the cold threats Julian Carter, a black passenger, received from the head flight attendant. On a first-class flight, he had paid full price for expecting to be treated with respect. What should have been the pinnacle of his career turned into the beginning of a nightmare in the skies. But what the airline didn't expect was that this man would not stay silent. He didn't just defend his own dignity. He dragged an entire system of injustice into the light, forcing a seemingly untouchable corporation to bow down and apologize to change. And in the end, they paid the price with their brand. If you believe that the truth always needs to be spoken, if you've ever dreamed of a world where everyone is treated fairly, then this story will make you cry, make you angry, and finally, give you hope. Don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to never miss real stories that touch the heart and inspire action. Now let's begin the unbelievable journey of Julian Carter. They refused to serve a black passenger until he called his lawyer and forced the airline to submit. Have you ever witnessed an act of injustice so outrageous that it made your blood boil? Buckle up, because the story you're about to hear will infuriate you and then leave you overflowing with emotion when justice is served. This wasn't just a case of poor customer service. It was a fierce battle against racism at an altitude of over 9,000 meters. What seemed like an ordinary flight turned into an arena of honor for one black man. No one could have predicted that the consequences of this would make an entire airline kneel. Julian Carter had always been a principled man. He never took shortcuts, never looked for ways to cheat, and always paid for everything with the hard-earned money he worked for. So when he decided to reward himself with a first-class ticket on a VistaAir flight from Newport City to Sapphire Bay, it wasn't a luxury. It was a well-deserved reward for his relentless efforts. This trip stemmed from an important conference Julian needed to attend. He was working for a large tech corporation where talent and hard work were considered top priorities. Though the company always boasted about progress and diversity, Julian often faced subtle prejudice, innuendos, scrutinizing looks, and subtle demeaning behavior. He was no stranger to such things, but he had never let them break his spirit. He always held his head high and let his achievements speak for themselves, rather than his skin color. With a bonus he had just received, Julian booked a first-class seat on VistaAir, symbolizing the progress he had tirelessly built. In the days leading up to the trip, he meticulously planned every detail from the ride to the airport to his newly purchased laptop bag. When he researched the plane's amenities, he felt a quiet joy. Flatbeds, gourmet meals, and personalized service. He didn't expect to be treated like royalty, just to be respected as promised and for which he had paid. But Julian couldn't have imagined that this dream journey would soon turn into a brutal nightmare. He was unaware that his presence in the first-class cabin would spark a horrific chain of events, one so intense that it would make the headlines of Sapphire Times Herald. And little did he know the flight would become a major turning point in his life, a confrontation with a massive corporation that would reshape his destiny. If you had asked Julian about VistaAir that week, he would have said he didn't even pay attention to the airline when booking the ticket, simply because the schedule was convenient and the price reasonable. But just a few days later, he would be the one holding the power to shake this company to its core. The day of the flight dawned with a light sunny morning. Julian, always punctual, arrived at Newport Skyport well ahead of time, carrying his shiny new laptop bag. He smoothly navigated through the crowded areas. This wasn't his first business trip, but this time with a first-class ticket, he walked with more confidence than ever. Finally, he could enjoy the spaciousness and attentive service. At the VistaAir check-in counter, everything initially seemed normal. Julian handed his documents to a female staff member who was polite but somewhat distant. She typed on the keyboard, avoiding his gaze, then printed the boarding pass. That was when he noticed her expression subtly change and her tone became just a bit different. "Here's your ticket." She smiled awkwardly. "Have a pleasant flight." A strange feeling settled in his chest, a silent tension. He had experienced this before. The scrutinizing glances, the hesitation when they saw his skin color. Was he being too sensitive? Maybe Julian reassured himself this was a major airline and the staff were professionally trained. He shrugged off the uncomfortable atmosphere and continued through security without incident. Then he entered the first-class lounge. A uniformed staff member checked his ticket, glanced at him, then looked back at the ticket. A few seconds of confusion passed before she forced a smile and said, "Welcome to the Vista Lounge. You can choose any seat." Julian sat down, trying to relax, blaming the pre-flight tension. When it was time to board, he joined the other first-class passengers in line. People dressed in sharp suits, some older and a few affluent-looking families. He handed his ticket to the staff member at the gate, who didn't even bother to look him in the eye. No suspicious glances, no awkward words. Julian thought everything would be fine. But in reality, this was just the calm before the storm. He found his seat in the first-class cabin, impressed by the thick cushions and spacious layout. The soft lighting filled the cabin, making him feel somewhat acknowledged. This was the fruit of many months of hard work, even if only for a fleeting moment. A blonde flight attendant approached her professional smile in place. But as soon as she saw Julian, her face momentarily tensed. She glanced at his boarding pass, almost as if verifying that he truly belonged in this section. "Good morning, sir. What would you like to drink before takeoff?" Her voice couldn't hide the underlying coldness behind her politeness. Though uncomfortable, Julian maintained his calm demeanor. "I'll have orange juice, thank you," he smiled, trying to keep things light. She nodded curtly, then hurried toward the back. When she returned, she placed the drink on the table without saying a word, then continued serving the other passengers with noticeably warmer attitudes. The difference was glaring, like a cold breeze passing over his seat. The flight attendant even chatted cheerfully with a middle-aged man a few seats ahead, laughing at his comments about the weather. With the elderly couple, she even inquired about their well-being and helped them store their luggage. But with Julian, she maintained a distant and uncomfortable attitude, which felt unsettling. The blonde flight attendant continued to chat and laugh with the passenger ahead of him, a man in a suit making jokes about the weather in Sapphire Bay. Then she lingered near an elderly couple, asking them if they needed help with their luggage. Everything about her demeanor radiating warmth and professionalism. But when she returned to Julian Carter, all expression seemed to be wiped away, leaving behind a coldness that was almost unbelievable. He couldn't imagine it. His heart sank as he clearly felt the sense of alienation within the first-class cabin. Still, Julian tried to remind himself not to think too negatively. He had grown used to these subtle discriminations at the grocery store and restaurants, or even just walking down the street. So why should a plane be any different? He took a deep breath, telling himself not to let small things ruin his entire journey. If this was the worst thing that happened on the flight, he would still consider himself lucky. But the truth was, this was just the beginning. The plane began rolling down the runway, and Julian had no idea that he was about to enter the darkest period of his life. About an hour after the plane reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign was turned off and service began. Trolleys full of food and drinks rolled down the aisle. From his seat, Julian watched the flight attendants, particularly the blonde flight attendant, the one he had noticed earlier with her cold demeanor, serve each passenger with a smile and questions filled with concern about their tastes and drink preferences. But when it came to his turn, something strange happened. They walked right past him. No glance, no question. She, whose name tag read Veronica, completely ignored him and continued serving the passengers in the back. Julian lifted his head, confused. He politely cleared his throat, hoping to get her attention witut causing a scene. But Veronica purposely refused to look his way, as if he were invisible. Not wanting to make a fuss, he gently pressed the call button. Another flight attendant, a young man with dark brown hair and a kind look in his eyes, approached. His name tag read, "Elliot?" Julian explained that he hadn't been asked for his order yet, and Elliot immediately apologized, noting his request with sincere attention. But just a few minutes later, Veronica appeared like a cold breeze. She approached him, her expression full of irritation, her voice heavy with what seemed to be anger. "Do you need something?" Each word she uttered felt as though she were speaking to a misbehaving child. Julian was taken aback. "I've already ordered with Elliot. He said he would bring it shortly." She furrowed her brow, her face seeming to take offense. "This is my area of responsibility. Next time you should wait for me to come around, sir." She emphasized the last word with an edge of sarcasm. Julian was stunned. He had behaved properly, patiently waiting. So why was he being treated like this? Before he could respond, Veronica turned and walked away, leaving him seething with anger and shock. His chest tightened both from hurt and frustration. He wanted to stand up, speak out, demand respect. But reason held him back. He was in the air in an environment that could be easily misinterpreted. A black man reacting loudly could easily be labeled as disruptive. He had a job, a conference to attend. He couldn't let one moment ruin everything, and so he stayed silent. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't over. A part of his intuition told him that this flight would only get worse. The plane continued to glide through the calm sky. The cabin lights were dimmed, creating a comfortable atmosphere for those who wanted to rest. Julian tried to focus on the materials he was preparing for his upcoming presentation, but his mind couldn't shake the image of Veronica each time she passed by, with a glare as sharp as a knife. Every time she walked by, without even looking at him, Julian could clearly feel her contempt. He tried to ignore it, but as time went on, the pressure grew more intense. The invisible tension weighed heavily in this space that should have been luxurious. At one point, he saw a white man sitting near the aisle, asking Veronica about how to connect to Wi-Fi. She explained each step happily, as if she were an old friend. When Julian encountered a similar issue, he waited for his turn and softly said, "Excuse me, I'm having a bit of trouble accessing the internet. Could you help me?" She glanced over and waved her hand dismissively, like shooing away a fly. "Everything is in the guide. Read it carefully." The response felt like a slap in the face. Every small action was pushing him to his breaking point. He remembered times when he had been excluded from school activities because of prejudice, or followed around in stores because of his skin color. But this time, the feeling of being trapped in a confined space made everything so much heavier. Unable to take it anymore, Julian discreetly gestured to Elliot as he walked by. "Excuse me, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Elliot nodded and led him to the galley near the front of the cabin. There were no passengers nearby to overhear. "I'm truly sorry for everything that's happened," Elliot said, his face full of concern. "I've noticed Veronica seems upset. I'll have a word with her." Julian swallowed his frustration. "I know she doesn't like me, but the way she ignores me, then scolds me in front of other passengers, it's unacceptable. I don't want to cause a scene, but this is going too far." Elliot nodded. "I understand. If you need any support, just let me know. I want to make this flight as comfortable as possible for you." Julian thanked him and returned to his seat, hoping that it would end there. But things were far from over. Just 20 minutes later, Veronica returned carrying a tray of food. Without saying a word, she slammed the tray down onto his table with enough force to make the spoon and fork clink against each other. "Did you talk to Elliot about me?" Her voice was filled with anger, causing a few passengers around them to turn and look. Julian tried to stay calm. "I just said I was having some issues with being served. That's all." She crossed her arms, her voice cutting like a knife. "I have my job to do. I can't cater to every little request, especially when I'm the head flight attendant for this first-class cabin." Julian could feel his heart rate increase. "I'm not asking for anything special. I just expect to be served like everyone else here." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't like your attitude. I've been doing this route for 5 years, and no one has complained until you." She leaned in close, almost whispering in his ear, but her tone was sharp and venomous. "People like you think that buying a ticket gives you special rights. But you're not the boss here." Julian froze. "Excuse me, what did you say?" "You heard me. If you don't want security called when we land, I suggest you eat quietly and don't make a scene." It was a threat, and Julian knew it all too well. But this time he couldn't back down. He looked her straight in the eyes. "You've crossed a line. I won't accept how you've treated me." He didn't raise his voice, didn't get angry. He simply turned away, denying her any further power from his resistance. But that calm action was the spark that set off a storm about to unfold. "This route I've been serving for 5 years, and no one has ever complained until you showed up." Veronica stood there, her voice cold, as if she were delivering a verdict. Julian Carter took a deep breath to keep himself calm. "Ma'am, I don't want to cause trouble," he said, his voice soft but firm, "but it feels like you're treating me differently." She didn't respond immediately, just stared at him with an unreadable look. Then suddenly she leaned down, whispering in his ear, her voice hoarse, as if sharing a secret. "People like you always think you deserve a red carpet, that just because you have money you can command others. But guess what? You're not here to give orders." Julian's heart pounded so hard it felt like it was about to jump out of his chest. What did you say?" he asked, unable to believe his ears. "You heard me clearly," she repeated, this time louder. "Sit down, eat your meal, and don't cause more trouble. If you do, I'll have security waiting for you when we land." "Got it." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. Julian froze, his body tensing. From the corner of his eye, he saw Elliot standing in the galley at the front of the cabin. His worried gaze fixed on them, the entire first-class cabin fell silent, and all eyes began to turn toward Julian and Veronica. In that moment, all the memories of being followed in stores, being suspected when entering upscale places, or having to prove his worth with every action, all of it seemed to flood his mind at once. He knew clearly if he let her dominate him, this would never stop. But he also understood just one reaction, deemed as out of control, could cost him his dignity, his job, even his freedom. So Julian did the only thing he could in that moment. He stayed still, his gaze calm. "You've crossed the line." Then he turned away, refusing to be drawn into any more provocations. He didn't need to shout to maintain his dignity. His silence, decisive, proud, was the strongest form of resistance. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin became suffocating. Passengers who had been laughing at the entertainment screens or dozing off now sat up straight, feeling the tension spreading like a wave. While Veronica continued to serve with eyes full of fire, Elliot tried to ease the tension, bringing Julian another glass of water and a small dessert as compensation. Julian sat still, his emotions a whirlwind, inside angry yet anxious. He knew just one wrong word, one uncontrolled reaction, and he'd be labeled as disruptive. A dangerous tag for any passenger, especially a black one. Time seemed to slow down. He kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until the plane would land in Sapphire Bay. But ironically, the next crisis came from the sky. The plane suddenly hit unexpected turbulence. The cabin shook violently, passengers swaying. Some screaming in fear, Veronica, who was checking the cabin, lost her balance and almost fell into Julian's armrest. Instead of standing up and continuing her work, she spun toward him, her eyes filled with fury. "You did that on purpose, didn't you?" Her voice rang out loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. Julian was stunned. "What, I didn't do anything? It's just the turbulence." But Veronica didn't stop. She turned to another flight attendant and yelled, "He reached out and blocked my way." "Did you see that?" The attendant simply shook his head, a confused look on his face. Some passengers around them started murmuring, "It's just turbulence." I didn't see anything, but Veronica insisted on accusing him. What seemed like a baseless accusation in an instant turned the issue from poor service into a serious security incident. Julian felt his heart drop, not only because of the shock, but because he knew if the pilot only heard one side of the story, he could be arrested the moment the plane landed, or worse, charged with assaulting a flight attendant. Fortunately, Elliot intervened just in time, pulling Veronica away before things escalated further. Julian slumped in his seat, his mind spinning. He tried to think to arrange everything in his head. How could he protect himself from this nightmare that was slowly unfolding? But the worst was yet to come. The plane finally landed at Sapphire International Airport. A collective sigh of relief echoed through the cabin. Julian, feeling like a heavy burden had been lifted, gathered his belongings. Every time a flight attendant passed by, he worried if he'd be escorted away. When the seatbelt sign went off, he stood up, but Elliot approached him. "Mr. Carter, I've spoken with the captain. Veronica made some accusations, but many passengers came forward to confirm the truth. You don't need to worry." Julian nodded, speechless, as his emotions overwhelmed him. Thank you for standing by me." Elliot placed a hand on his shoulder sincerely. "I'm really sorry this happened. We'll file a report about the incident. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask." Julian felt a deep gratitude toward this silent ally, but also sadness that what should have been an eagerly anticipated trip had turned into a humiliating experience. He walked past the first-class cabin door where Veronica stood glaring at him. He didn't respond, just walked straight ahead, but he could clearly feel her burning gaze following every step as he exited the plane. As he entered the terminal, he let out a sigh of relief, feeling like he had just escaped from a suffocating room. He pulled his suitcase toward the escalator to baggage claim, when unexpectedly 2 airport security officers approached with serious expressions. "Excuse me, are you?" "Julian Carter," one of them asked. He nodded, his throat dry. "We've received a complaint from a flight attendant claiming there was an assault on the flight." Anger surged within Julian's chest. He clenched his fists but kept his voice calm. "She's making false accusations. There are several passengers who witnessed and are ready to testify." The 2 officers listened, initially skeptical, but after verifying statements and receiving information from fellow passengers, their demeanor softened. Eventually, they apologized for the inconvenience and allowed him to leave without further investigation, but the damage had been done. Julian stood there, suitcase at his feet, his heart heavy. A business trip he had been eagerly anticipating now turned into a painful experience, and he had no idea that this was just the beginning of an even larger battle. After arriving at his hotel in Sapphire Bay, Julian Carter stepped into his room and collapsed onto the bed. His body felt exhausted, but not from the long flight. Rather, it was the tension that had built up over the past few hours that refused to leave. His adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, and his mind was full of unanswered questions, along with a simmering anger. He should have been preparing for the biggest tech conference of the year, but all his thoughts were consumed by the first-class cabin on that fateful flight, where he wasn't just ignored, but threatened and falsely accused. Not willing to let his emotions dissipate without clarity, He sat up, grabbed his phone, and began writing down every detail of what had happened. Every suspicious glance, every cruel word, every cold gesture, he noted it, all time-stamping each entry according to the flight schedule. He didn't want the memory to fade, not when this could become a turning point for something bigger. He also made a note of the flight attendants' names, especially Elliot, the only kind one, and Veronica, the woman who had turned his journey into a nightmare in the sky. Once finished, Julian went online to search for any posts related to VistaAir and accusations of racial discrimination. He found only a few scattered complaints, none as clear-cut as his. This made him think maybe others had chosen to stay silent, or simply hadn't had the chance to speak up. That evening he attended the opening session of the conference. When a few colleagues asked how his flight had been, Julian just smiled lightly and answered briefly, "It was fine," but inside, he was still seething with the sense of injustice. After the session, he returned to his room, reopened his notes, and read through each line again. Each word was a sharp reminder of the pain, but this time it wasn't just pain, it was motivation. He suddenly realized this wasn't just a service failure. It was targeted harassment, blatant racial prejudice, and a flagrant abuse of power. If he let this slide, he would be complicit, and the world would think this kind of behavior is acceptable. He opened his phone and searched for a civil rights lawyer in Sapphire Bay. A name appeared repeatedly in the reviews. Richard Hale, a seasoned lawyer known for making major corporations pay for their wrongdoings. Julian saved the number, determined to call as soon as his conference schedule allowed. A new feeling emerged within him, not frustration, but the will to fight. 2 days later, after finishing his presentation at the conference, Julian found the time and resolved to make the call. The office assistant answered her professional voice, asking for some basic information before scheduling an in-person meeting. The law firm was just a few blocks away from his hotel. As he walked into the office, Julian was impressed by the quiet yet serious atmosphere that enveloped the plate-glass walls, minimalist furniture, and an air of authority emanating from every corner. He was invited into a private meeting room, and Richard Hale walked in just a few minutes later. The middle-aged man with graying hair and deep eyes that seemed to penetrate the heart of the issue. He shook Julian's hand, sat across from him, and got straight to the point. "Mr. Carter, I want to hear the full story from the moment you stepped into the airport to when you left security." Julian took a deep breath and recounted everything, the details, the words, the looks. Richard silently took notes, occasionally interrupting to clarify certain points. When the story ended, the lawyer leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. "We don't get clear-cut cases like this every day," he said. "From what you've told me, this is a case of blatant racial discrimination, possibly violating both federal and state civil rights laws." Julian exhaled but remained cautious. "So, can we sue?" Richard nodded. "Absolutely. The behavior of the flight attendant along with the false accusations could have gotten you arrested. That's serious misconduct. If the airline tries to cover for her, it could get even worse. But we need more evidence, witness statements, internal reports from the airline, and if possible, audio or video footage from the cabin." Julian sat up straighter. "I've kept in touch with a few passengers. They reached out to me after the flight and said they're willing to testify. And Elliot, the young male attendant, was very sympathetic." "Very good," Richard smiled. "The more witnesses, the better. We'll file the official paperwork and start the legal process. Are you ready for a long fight?" Julian paused for a few seconds, then remembered Veronica's gaze, the blatant threat, and the moments when he almost lost everything due to her false accusations. "Yes," he replied firmly. "I'm ready." In the days that followed, Julian and Richard's office began preparing the lawsuit against VistaAir, alleging racial discrimination and defamation. Julian reached out again to the passengers he knew, asking if they were willing to provide statements or written descriptions of the incident. Fortunately, many agreed without hesitation. Everyone was outraged by what they had witnessed. Elliot, the young attendant, became the most crucial link. Even though he knew he could risk his job, he was willing to share the truth. Not only did he confirm Veronica's mistreatment of Julian, but he also revealed that this wasn't the first time. He'd heard of other complaints, but all had been quietly suppressed, just a few apology vouchers, and no one had spoken out. As the lawsuit was being submitted to court, the media began to take notice. Sapphire Times-Herald ran a headline: VistaAir Airlines accused of serious racial discrimination. Julian's phone rang nonstop. Journalists, civil rights organizations, even other victims reached out to him. They shared similar stories, most of which had been silenced. Meanwhile, VistaAir responded in its typical fashion, denying and downplaying the issue. They issued a press release claiming a commitment to diversity while launching an internal investigation. The airline's lawyers quietly sent a settlement offer with a small sum of money and a non-disclosure agreement. Richard rejected it outright. "My client doesn't need money to stay silent. We need accountability and systemic change." When lawyer Richard Hale played his strategic card, the witness statements from fellow passengers and Elliot's confirmation, the negotiation immediately stalled. VistaAir realized they were facing a public relations nightmare if the lawsuit went to trial. However, instead of opting for a thorough settlement, the airline's leadership decided to take a risky gamble to fight to the end. They believed their brand was strong enough to withstand a single passenger daring to demand justice. They thought they could tire him out, make him frustrated, and he would eventually give up. But they were wrong, very wrong. As the case spread, social media erupted with hashtags like #IkiFly, "When You Arrive," and "Freakin' VistaAir Racism," attracting thousands of posts from passengers who had faced similar situations. While not everyone had been treated as badly as Julian, the overwhelming number of previously hidden stories made it impossible for the public to ignore. The news quickly spread across major television networks. Julian Carter's image appeared on screen, not as a victim, but as someone who dared to stand up. Every time he shared his experience, the sympathy and support grew. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been belittled and judged because of their skin color without a voice. Meanwhile, VistaAir fumbled to control the crisis. Their public relations team issued smooth statements about their commitment to diversity and building an inclusive environment. But these empty words couldn't hide the truth that was becoming clearer by the day. The airline's stock plummeted as investors started to lose confidence in their future. Amid the media storm, Julian continued to maintain his daily routine, working at his tech company, completing projects on time. But he couldn't avoid the calls from the press, the viral articles, or the encouraging emails from strangers that arrived every day. His private life had become a public battleground for the fight against racial injustice. Lawyer Richard Hale worked tirelessly to prepare for the upcoming trial. He told the press, "This is not just about one bad flight attendant. This is about a system that enables discrimination, and we will force it to change." At the time, rumors began to circulate that Veronica had been suspended from work. However, VistaAir neither confirmed nor denied it. Many guessed that she would be made a scapegoat so the company could easily avoid responsibility. But Julian and Richard knew firing one individual wouldn't fix a toxic culture. In Julian's heart, he always remembered why he was fighting. He thought of that future black child saving money to buy a first-class ticket with hopes of being respected, only to be treated as an intruder. He thought of all the times he had been judged for his skin color, not his character. For the first time in his life, Julian felt that he could make a real change, and he was determined not to let that opportunity slip away. As the discovery phase began, Richard's legal team demanded all relevant documents from VistaAir flight logs, crew lists, training materials, and especially any previous complaints related to similar behavior from Veronica. The airline objected, accusing the plaintiffs of unfounded digging, but the judge approved the request. Given the seriousness of the allegations, they could not be ignored. What was revealed next left Julian both stunned and outraged. Internal emails revealed that Veronica had been the subject of at least 3 previous complaints about biased and discriminatory behavior. In every case, the airline had quietly settled, issuing discount vouchers and requiring the complainants to sign non-disclosure agreements. A series of emails between managers even explicitly stated, "We need to keep this quiet. Negative press will be very damaging." Julian felt a wave of conflicting emotions. There was validation what he endured was real, and not the first time. But there was also anger because the airline knew and still protected her. They had prioritized silence over human dignity. Elliott's testimony became even more valuable. He confirmed that he had witnessed similar behavior from Veronica on another flight, but back then he was too new to understand what was happening. His account perfectly matched the internal documents, a piece of undeniable evidence that the airline had neglected its responsibility to its passengers. Richard immediately filed for a summary judgment, arguing that the evidence was clear enough to avoid further delays. But VistaAir refused. They still wanted the case to go to court, perhaps believing the jury would sympathize or find a procedural loophole. But in the eyes of the public, VistaAir had already lost. New hashtags appeared everywhere. Cloudy skies and flying 3 times is too. Much prominent figures began speaking out, calling for a boycott of VistaAir. Several major travel companies had removed the airline from their list of preferred partners. Julian watched this media storm with mixed emotions, both excited and a little scared. He had never wanted to be a symbol of something so grand, but now he had become the center of a societal shift. On the day the trial officially took place, a long line of reporters stood outside the courthouse. Julian and Richard quietly walked through, undistracted by flashing lights or hurried questions. Inside, the atmosphere was as tense as a taut string. VistaAir sent a formidable team of lawyers. Richard was no less prepared, with a group of associates carrying thick binders full of evidence. The courtroom was packed. Some were activists, others law students, and some just ordinary people wanting to witness the proceedings firsthand. At the opening, Richard presented a carefully prepared story, not just about the wrongdoing of one individual, but about a system that had enabled injustice and how an ordinary man had dared to say enough. The trial reached its crucial stage when VistaAir's lawyers attempted to downplay the case, claiming that everything had been blown out of proportion, that the previous complaints were irrelevant, and that they had been resolved satisfactorily. They even blamed Julian Carter himself, accusing him of being the one who instigated the situation, deliberately provoking the flight attendant and creating tension. But then witnesses began to take the stand. Each passenger present in the first-class cabin that day stood up and recounted in detail how Veronica had been cold, discriminatory, and belittling toward Julian in front of everyone. The testimonies were eerily consistent, almost as if everyone had remembered every moment because it was so clear, so wrong. The climax came when Elliott, the only flight attendant who had stood by Julian, took the stand. In a calm, neutral voice, he recounted everything from Veronica's icy glare to her false accusation that Julian had deliberately caused her to fall. Elliott's entire testimony completely dismantled Veronica's version of events. When it was her turn, Veronica stepped up, clearly tense. Her eyes darted nervously between her lawyer and the jury. She clung tightly to the script she had prepared, that Julian had demanded too much, that he had provoked her on purpose, that she had been threatened. But Richard Hale, with surgical precision, dismantled every detail. With his notes, the witness testimonies, and the final blow, her contradictory statements in previous depositions. The hardest blow came when Richard presented the internal email system from VistaAir. The atmosphere in the courtroom almost came to a standstill. Each email full of attempts to cover up hush deals and the frightening repetition of the so-called internal resolution was read aloud, word by word. When the final line was read, Veronica's face turned pale. The airline's legal team looked visibly worried. For the first time, everyone understood. that VistaAir hadn't just failed because of one unethical employee. They had failed because of an entire rotten system maintained through silence and fear. A resounding victory. As the trial entered the deliberation phase, the atmosphere in the room was suffocating. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the verdict. And then, after hours of tension, the jury returned to the courtroom. The verdict was announced. VistaAir was found guilty of violating civil rights laws, engaging in racial discrimination, and defaming Julian Carter's character. The court ordered the airline to compensate Julian for both emotional distress and damage to his reputation, with a sum reaching millions of dollars, an amount that stunned both the media and the public. But what was more important was the court's mandatory order. VistaAir must implement a comprehensive anti-racism training program, establish a transparent complaint reporting system, and conduct a full evaluation of its corporate culture from the ground up. A wave of relief and joyous celebration filled the courtroom. Julian hugged Richard tightly, his eyes teary. In that moment, all the emotions seemed to blend together: relief, gratitude, and a sense of restored dignity after years of silently enduring. As cameras snapped pictures, Julian no longer kept his head down as he had before. He stood tall, facing the hundreds of flashing lights, and said, "This isn't just a victory for me, but for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly because of their skin color." A collapsing airline. A movement born. In the days following the verdict, VistaAir fell into a full-blown crisis. Shareholders demanded the resignation of top executives, especially those who had covered up the wrongdoing. The CEO announced his resignation for personal reasons, but everyone knew it was the inevitable consequence. Veronica was officially fired, but to the public the punishment was far too late. Rumors spread that VistaAir might need to cut back its operations significantly or even file for bankruptcy. Gradually, travel partners, businesses, and even longtime customers began to pull away, unwilling to continue their association with an airline now synonymous with racism and cover-ups. Julian didn't feel satisfaction at the prospect of thousands of people potentially losing their jobs, but he understood. If the airline had listened to complaints from the beginning, if they had acted when he first spoke up, all this tragedy could have been prevented. A new chapter for Julian Carter. After the lawsuit, Julian's life changed completely. The compensation allowed him to pay off debts, care for his family, and donate a significant portion to civil rights organizations. He hadn't chosen to become famous, but the invitations to speak at panels and conferences came flooding in. Companies invited him to share his thoughts on workplace equality, corporate responsibility, and the dangerous silence surrounding injustice. In every talk, he often brought Richard Hale along to analyze the legal consequences when companies ignore discrimination. At times, Julian felt overwhelmed by his new role as an unwitting spokesperson for a movement. But whenever he remembered Veronica's glare, the threat of, "I'll call security," or the feeling of being treated as an outsider in a first-class cabin where he had paid in full, he knew he couldn't turn back. Now he was living proof of a simple yet profound truth. When you dare to stand up alone if necessary, you can force an entire system to kneel. When Julian Carter walked out of the courthouse that day, he was no longer just a passenger who had been treated unjustly on a flight. He had become living proof of the truth that when one person dares to stand up and refuses to accept injustice, an entire system that seems unshakable can fall. Julian's journey began with a first-class ticket, a symbol of effort, success, and personal worth. But it quickly turned into a ticket that led him into an unexpected battle, an uneven confrontation with one of the largest airline corporations. He had no PR team, no powerful allies. The only things he had were the truth evidence and an indomitable will. And that's why what seemed impossible became reality. An airline had to bow its head in apology. Its internal culture was exposed, and the entire industry had to reflect on itself. Julian's story isn't just about a successful lawsuit. It's a reminder to all of us that the right to be respected and treated fairly is not a privilege, but a fundamental right every human being deserves. He had been overlooked, threatened, and nearly falsely accused simply for speaking the truth. But instead of staying silent, he chose to step forward. And because of that choice, countless people who had experienced exclusion, disdain, and disregard now had a voice. This story doesn't end in the courtroom. It doesn't end when the verdict is read. It continues every time someone remembers Julian Carter and dares to speak out when faced with injustice. In a world where invisible boundaries still exist, where suspicious eyes fall on someone simply because of their skin color, ethnicity, or background, we need people like Julian, people who not only stand up for themselves, but who also stand up for those who cannot. And if there is one thing you take away from this journey, let it be this belief. One person, one story, one voice, when backed by truth and determination, can absolutely change the world. When the plane landed at Sapphire Bay, Julian Carter didn't just disembark from a flight. He stepped out of an old world where subtle discrimination hid behind polite smiles and cautious glances. He embarked on a new journey, one where truth is the compass and justice is the goal. From an ordinary man who just wanted to live peacefully and work, Julian became the spokesperson for thousands of people who had been treated unfairly, but never had the opportunity to speak out. He didn't rally, he didn't seek the spotlight, but every action he took from his first testimony to standing before the press cameras was a declaration that respect is not a privilege. It's a fundamental human right. VistaAir, a once arrogant airline on the international market, has now become a cautionary tale for the entire service industry. There was a time when they believed a single passenger could do nothing, but they forgot when one person dares to say enough. The whole world must listen. Julian's story reminds us that never underestimate the small details, like a cold gaze or a mocking word. Never think that silence will make everything go away. And most importantly, never underestimate the power of one person, standing up for what is right. Julian didn't just reclaim his own dignity. He paved the way for others to step out of silence so that together we can strive for a more just society where every passenger, every person is welcomed as they truly deserve. If this story moved, made you angry, and ultimately made you believe that change is possible, then like this post, share this video with those you believe need to hear this story, and subscribe to the channel to continue following inspiring journeys rooted in truth, courage, and the pursuit of justice. Leave your thoughts in the comments, because who knows, your voice might be the motivation someone else needs to rise up tomorrow.